Newsmaker Sunday with Fox 10's John Hook.
For joining us on Newsmaker Sunday, the governor calls the Arizona legislature into special session to deal with this settlement of the lawsuit filed by schools to recover money that the legislature stopped paying during the economic downturn. We're talking about a bunch of money. We're talking about millions. And these are dollars the schools need. The question is, how far are we moving the needle with this settlement that looks like it's a done deal? Joining us this week on Newsmaker Sunday, on my far right, the far left of your screen, is Andrew Morrill, president of the Arizona Education Association. Pearl Chang Esau is the president and CEO of Expect More Arizona Advocacy Group. And Chuck Essigs is the director of Governmental Relations, Arizona Association of School Business Officials. These are some of the best minds concerning this issue. I'll start with you, Chuck, because you've been around the longest. Pardon me, but you have. And it's a good thing. Experience matters. Okay. Is this a good deal? It's 70 cents on the dollar, this settlement. Does this change much?
I think when you look at the timing and where we are, the lawsuit was filed 5 years ago, and schools have, we have kids going halfway through their elementary school programs. Some kids have graduated from high school and not gotten any benefit from the inflation lawsuit the way it should have been funded. So I think it's time to get it settled and get moving forward. It just doesn't solve all the problems with education funding, but at least it settles the inflation funding lawsuit, and now we can move forward to more serious look at how we fund our schools.
Pearl, is it a case of some money is better than no money? Get something out of this.
We feel like the settlement is a step in the right direction. You know, we were not at the table, we're not one of the plaintiffs, but I think from a community perspective, you know, we need to move forward. We have a lot of really big issues we need to tackle in education. We look at this settlement not as the end-all be-all solution, but it's an important step in the right direction. It gets us going that way. We still need to keep the long-term view in mind. But the settlement is a settlement. It's a settlement to the inflation lawsuit. It's not meant to be an answer to all the other issues that we have going on.
Andrew, you represent teachers, of course, and what's the feeling of teachers and the folks on the front lines?
You know, honestly, John, sometimes doing the right thing doesn't necessarily feel all that great. The clarity comes the closer you move to students in the classroom. This is where we see the crushing need for funding that has been lost over a long period of time. This is where we see teachers leaving in droves. We don't have a shortage of teachers in Arizona. We have a shortage of people willing to teach under the current conditions.
I just spoke to a teacher about that Friday morning, or Thursday morning, actually.
And you probably have that conversation again and again and again. We pin so many hopes on public education, and rightfully so. But Chuck and Pearl are correct. This was the settlement of one funding mechanism in a very complex picture of education funding. It's good to have this settled. It is certainly good to put money in the direction it's going to go. But this can't be the last conversation we have on public education funding in Arizona.
We've got to figure a long-term mechanism.
Absolutely.
To do this. Chuck, explain to people out there, because you know, voters approved this. The legislature in the downturn, looking at the budget, they said, well, what can we cut? And they went after education, even though they knew they were going to be sued over this. They did it anyway. I think the public is looking at this and saying, how is it the legislature just arbitrarily said, we're not going to fund it, when it was statutorily demanded? How did that happen?
If you have one of them here, they would say they just didn't have the money because the economic downturn was so severe. And what's interesting,
I've heard that, right.
In this settlement, we've kind of addressed that. One of the things that they had to have in order to settle this was some relief if we went through another real severe economic downturn.
Right.
So we have that. But what schools wanted, when that was over, we wanted the funding to go back to where it would have been had they done it correctly each year. And we got that. So most settlements are you give and take, and we gave them some relief in a bad economic time, and they gave us the security that when we go out of those bad times, we'll put the schools back to fully funded inflation level rather than just partial.
When is the last, we talked about this, I think it goes back to the 80s when schools in Arizona were appropriately, whatever that means, funded.
During the 90s, we lost tremendous ground to inflation. When Governor Symington, and not just to criticize him, there were other people, when bad economic times hit, they cut schools and said, we can't afford to give you inflation
because schools
increase.
are 50% of the budget.
Right. And then when schools needed the money and the economic times were better, some people said, well, schools don't need inflation funding during the 90s. You know, it's not needed. So we got screwed every time, good years and bad years. The nice thing about what the voters approved in 1980 was to say we're going to address that issue, and we're going to assure that schools keep pace with inflation. They don't lose ground to inflation, they keep pace with inflation.
The money that's coming in per pupil, how much more is it?
It's about $170 on what's called the base level, the base part of the formula. It'd be a couple $100 more per student.
Andrew, what can you do with a couple $100 more per student?
Well, put it in the hands of a local governing board elected out of a community. You can address salaries and compensation. Now, we're not talking about moving Arizona to the average across the states, but we're talking about improvements in the current conditions.
This is for teacher retention.
It can be. It can be for reinstatement of programs that have been lost because schools couldn't afford to deliver them. It could be for improving technology and resources that students use on a daily basis. You could control a little bit of class size and manage that, which parents and educators care a great deal about. That was one of the important terms, John, of the settlement, was let districts decide what the best uses were for this money. This actually isn't new money, and I want to address that.
It's just a recovery of what was already owed.
This is owed money, that's right. So it really should come in with maximum flexibility on the part of districts.
Do you see that this is a real benefit, Pearl, to classrooms on the ground in districts, that this will be helpful? Or will it not make that much of a difference?
Yes, I think it's going to be helpful. I mean, we need to start walking in the right direction. And I think this settlement deal gets us going there. We can't let this be the, okay, we're done, we plugged the hole, we're going to, you know.
Are you afraid the public's going to read it that way, saying, okay, now we've solved the funding issue, let's move on to whatever it is? Are you worried about that?
I think that concern is out there, and what we need to make sure to do is that this isn't that we don't let this be the end, right? I mean, we're at an important point in time where, and I really respect the parties coming together. I know it was very difficult. And everybody feels like they gave up a little bit, but I think that they did the right thing, and I think we need to follow their lead and support the direction this is going, but then also looking to the future of, and it's not just for us about climbing the rankings on where we rank in per pupil funding, although clearly we need more resources, and resources are really important. For us, it is about, we want to make sure that our students are improving, that we're making sure that every student is graduating high school ready for that next step. So every bit of money can help us to move in that direction. And I would have to agree with Andrew that the best thing we can do is give it into the hands of strong local leadership and invest in supporting our educators.
And pray they spend it wisely. Explain to me, Andrew, how it is that we get this national report card this week. Sure. Arizona's right around the middle, the average, 4th and 8th grade on math and reading. How are we doing this, ranking 48th in the nation in per pupil funding?
We're doing this because we've got thousands and thousands of absolutely fabulous, committed, professional educators, principals, the people in our schools. What this says to me are the people we need in our schools. We've just lost too many of them. And I know that one legislator at least has described this as a great thing. We're in the middle of the pack in rankings for achievement and at the bottom for funding. If we want to make of our students and our children some sort of bargain basement deal, I guess that's the way you could look at it. I don't think that satisfies parents. And frankly, I don't think it satisfies too many policymakers. You have legislative leadership, a governor, the education advocates, and community members all over the state saying we've got to do better. That's one of the things that made this so necessary, was to take advantage of this moment that might not last forever and say, let's at least take, I like this idea of walking in the right direction. Let's at least take the first few steps, settle this case so that we can move forward.
Let me ask you about what these tests actually mean. You say they mean less about education and more about poverty.
The most respected national experts on what assessments actually show agree. They show more about the economic challenges that a student encounters on a daily basis in the home than they do about the potential learning of that student. No teacher that I know thinks of his or her students as nothing more than a test score. Sadly, that's what we've done with policy. And 15 years ago, we said, if we make standardized test scores the end-all be-all of policy, then that's going to condense everything we understand about good teaching and learning. We have an opportunity, because so many parents are pushing back against this, to move in a better direction. Actually, the state of Arizona is in a couple of places, in a couple of different directions, looking at what that A-letter rating of a school or district really means, and I think that's a positive conversation.
You're kind of weaving into a discussion, I think now, about this assault on Common Core, which we had some movement on that with the board this week. Some say it doesn't mean much. Where are we on this issue of Common Core? Is this national standard that was established and all it was benchmarks? Is that going to go away?
Well, I really hope not, because if you talk to educators in Arizona, they don't need another rug pulled out from under them. They have dedicated themselves for better.
My kids they're age 11, my twin boys.
I've got a daughter who's 11.
Okay, you know how many of these kinds of tests they've gone through in
Yes.
just that amount of time.
And they've gone through too many, and I see this as an education advocate and a former teacher, but also as a current parent.
Right.
But listen, these standards are good. It is good to have high expectations of students.
So what's the hang up?
We don't have the resources to be as serious as we want about the success of every student in our schools. What we did was we went rich and lavish on expectations, appropriately so, but we never put the business plan together to drive the state toward the outcomes. So we can do that, but changing the standards, pulling the rug out from under the standards is not the answer. Let's keep our eye on a high mark, on a high prize that educators, after all, the vast majority support. Then let's get serious about the strategies and the resources and the investments we need.
Let's talk about this for a second, because now we're getting into the funding issue. Is there a better way to fund schools than property taxes?
I think property taxes is one. Most states rely quite heavily on property taxes. They'll use general fund monies coming from sales. I think you need a combination of those.
And in Arizona, our mix is what?
Well, the state general fund is sales tax and income tax are the two biggest things. There used to be a statewide property tax.
Right.
And that's been eliminated.
Exactly.
So that's hurt a lot.
So
But
property taxes are really for overrides to let individual districts go
property taxes are to
above.
fund the local share, and the state has a small county tax rate that provides some money for schools. But I think you need a combination of
What about a
funds.
consumption, some type of consumption tax?
You just have to avoid, if I may jump in,
Yes.
you just have to avoid things that are especially recession sensitive, because Arizona will go through its cyclical recessions here and there. You know, the voters seem to give a lot of latitude on sales tax, but sales tax is one of the most recession sensitive forms of revenue.
We just went through it.
We did, and we saw what happened. It can drop like a stone. The thing about property taxes is a lot of people move into areas because of the quality of schools. So there is a little bit of an organic connection there. But Chuck, who is a recognized expert on this across the state, is of course correct. You want a blend of approaches so that if one revenue source suffers, it's backed up by other means.
May I ask you, while we're on this topic, there are several initiatives I think we're looking at right now dealing with marijuana, recreational legalization of marijuana, where I think the way to appeal to the public, they're saying the money would go to education, the tax money, if we tax it. Who here is in favor of going down that road?
I am sort of, but what you need to be very careful about.
The man with the most experience.
Right?
What you need to be very careful about the expectations of people. When Indian gaming came about in this state, when regular gaming came in this state, the thing was we're going to put money into education.
The lottery also.
Yes, that's right.
There's about $40 per student from the Indian gaming going into education. That's appreciated, but that doesn't solve the problems. The same thing with taxing marijuana. The other people may disagree or whatever, but as long as that's one of the sources of money, but it has to be a small source because first it's always going to be a small part of the state economy.
I think above the arguments of just whether you think marijuana should be legalized, if you start attaching money for education to it, I think it passes easily.
It may, but one of the problems, in addition to the morality issues, which I know are a little bit outside of the finance argument.
Right, but I had to ask you guys because you've got your own.
But here's the thing, Arizona is okay at identifying revenue sources. We're much better at getting rid of them. So my question would be, if we bring in a new revenue source, is there going to be an equal measure to cut something else? Because
where you're just spinning your wheels.
Well, sure, because Arizona's trajectory over the last 25 years has been to eliminate revenue.
Pearl, who does it well? Who does it well around the country and has a good blend where it's stable, it's reliable, and it's fair and equitable?
You know, California is doing some really interesting things right now, and you know, I think we have an opportunity in Arizona because the governor has commissioned the Classrooms First Council that's meeting regularly, and they're going to make their recommendations on a revision to the K-12 school funding formula on December 2nd. And one of the things they're looking at, which is actually something that California has done recently, is the idea of an opportunity weight. And the idea there would be to try to acknowledge the factor that Andrew brought up earlier of poverty.
Yeah.
And understanding that it is more expensive to educate students from low-income backgrounds because they're coming to school with additional needs. So how do we
They're
make
at a
sure
deficit.
that, right, in the formula that we're treating them equitably?
You have to weight it that way.
Right,
then.
you have to
so
weight it that way.
in a wealthy district, they may not get the same amount of funding. They might have to deal with property taxes to make up the difference.
I believe that to truly put our students on an equal playing field where we're giving every child access to what they need to be successful, we are going to need to fund schools that serve low-income students at a higher level.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, that's reflective really of the philosophy of educators. You won't hear educators say these children can't learn. If that was an ethic in this country, I can tell you it's decades old and has been replaced by a commitment to educate every student. But we have to recognize the challenges in access to literacy, materials, technology. The acquisition of language actually ties to how many words are spoken in a household, and we know that that varies greatly across economic levels. So what educators want is to give every student that great start, and the great start that children have as they become adults is often delivered through their public school system. So we need the resources available to do that.
Chuck, go ahead.
Well, Pearl said it really well in steps. And settling the inflation lawsuit was a small step. It will certainly help. It won't change our rankings, but it will allow districts to restore some of the things they had to cut. If we could come up with a way of adequately funding and providing district resources to deal with at-risk kids, so as Andrew mentioned, early on in their education, they get caught up and can move forward, that would be a big step.
And you might actually save money that way in the long haul.
Well, you would if you could get kids started right.
Let me ask you, in terms of the funding issue, is Arizona, I don't know quite how to put this, is Arizona starting, is there a recognition beginning that we have got to do this in a better way? And is there the political will, do you believe? You've been around a while. Do you think that there's some recognition that there's got to be a better way to do this?
Well, being around a while is a good thing.
He's got experience.
No, I know. Experience is a key word.
But yeah, I'm seeing that in some legislative philosophies, but especially in the business world. What we're seeing is the business community.
Let me read, by the way. I hate to interrupt. This is from the Glenn Hammer, Arizona Chamber of Commerce. He called this proposal that we're talking about today a huge win for public schools. So even the business community, a recognition that we've got to do better.
And I think, because what they're realizing is that we're not getting people to come to Arizona, we're not getting businesses to come to Arizona, because they start looking at how we fund education, and it's a turn.
We got to take a break, but I have one quick point I need to ask you. Do we know for certain that there is a nexus between spending, money, and outcomes? Do we know that?
Well,
we do.
I think so.
you look long term and you can find it.
What,
Well, when you look at the kind of services that are provided
I
to
think
students.
it's how we spend the money too. I mean, I
Oh,
think
definitely
there's
how we
definitely a correlation between
so
spending
just
money
spending
on
more
strategies that
doesn't
work.
mean necessarily you'll get a better outcome.
And spending
Just
less is
spend
no
it.
guarantee either.
Spending less will
we've
almost
been trying
guarantee.
This is
that.
what the lawmakers want to know, in essence. They
Well,
want to know, if we're going to spend it, what are we going to get for it? And that's a reasonable question for a policymaker to ask.
It's a
should
reasonable
expect
question for a policymaker to ask. It's a reasonable question for the public to ask. But at the same time, let's add some context. We have been decreasing the general fund revenue in this state by billions since the 90s, when, by the way, our economy was somewhat stronger. And at the same, it's a little tough for educators to understand why at the same time education funding is dropping, there's this sort of indignation about why, when educators identify problems and challenges while we're boosting the expectations of our students. Right. They want to deliver. Educators come into education, certainly not to get wealthy, but they do come in to change. It sounds a little hokey, but educators really do believe they're going to change the world one student at a time. They would like the state to invest in that success.
The teacher I spoke of, that I spoke to Thursday morning, he left the private sector. He's making 60% less than he made in the private sector, but he said he's never been happier, despite all these
We hear that
challenges,
from time
because he wants to do this.
We hear that from time to time, but we cannot ask teachers, and it's not just teachers in our public schools, all those folks, are we really going to ask them to choose between just the ability to pay their bills, keep their home, put something away for their own financial security, or have a career in public education. That's a terrible choice to ask.
We'll take a break on that note. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about Common Core. We'll get into that a little bit, even though it gets out of the funding realm. But I've got to ask these guys since I've got them here, and it's a great panel. We're back in a minute on Newsmaker Sunday. Back on Newsmaker Sunday, we're talking education and obviously the situation we're trying to settle this lawsuit this week. Chuck Essigs, we talked about Common Core going into the break. Funding could be restored to help meet those benchmarks set out by Common Core.
I think a number of districts will use a portion of the money that's coming to them to bring some of the training programs back that they had to cut.
Why has this become such a bad term, Common Core? Why has it become so toxic?
I think there's been a lot of misperceptions about the origins of the standards. One of the things that's important to highlight is that a lot of Arizonans were involved in developing the standards. I mean, we have a professor that you've had on the show before, you know, Professor McCallum,
right,
who was a part of that.
U of A.
And I think it's really important to us in Arizona that we have authority over what we are doing, and we want to have that local control. And what we need to understand is that our State Board of Education has always had the ability to adopt, review, and change the standards. The vote we just had on Monday just reaffirmed that, but that ability was there before that.
You've both got kids in school. Why are parents so up in arms about Common Core?
Well, I can tell you from the point of view of somebody who used to be a high school English teacher, and now I am a parent of an 11-year-old, and I have a 15-year-old. The difference in how I could help my 15-year-old just a few years ago with his work it has changed a great deal in the way that my daughter, who is 4 years younger, is approaching. And the difference
in a good way?
Well, yes.
More difficult for the parent, though.
More difficult for the student. My daughter brings home project-oriented, very high-level lessons and homework. Just last night, she was on that brink of tears. But I have a feeling that when I was an English teacher, I caused a few students some tears also.
Right.
Challenging students is a good idea. What we need to do is answer the other part of the equation. What do we need in our schools? What do we need for our educators that translates to the success for students?
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. We'll leave it there. The first segment went long, but we'll be back to wrap this up and get an idea where we go from here when we return on Newsmaker Sunday. Final thoughts about where we're going with education funding in this state. Pearl Chang Esau, how do you feel we're progressing now? Better?
Yes, I mean, well, I think we're poised now to move forward, and I think that's what we all want. We got to move forward. One of the most important things we could do for education in our state is to make sure that Arizona is the very best place to attract and keep great teachers. And I mean, our organization has been amongst one of the loudest advocates for higher standards, for the more rigorous standards that we have in place today. We need to stay the course. We're headed in a good direction. We need to keep going with those, but we've absolutely got to make sure that the educators that we have in our classrooms are supported and have what they need to be able to teach those standards well. And if we can match those two things up, I'm really excited about the future and about my kids are, on the younger side, they're about to go into school.
Right.
I see the way that we're teaching kids really moving in the right way. We're preparing kids for jobs that don't even exist today.
Right.
They've got
That's
to be critical thinkers, problem solvers, and the new standards help us get there.
Chuck, 30 seconds. Do you think this has become a turning point in the discussion about education funding?
I think the turning point was before this, but it allowed this to happen. But the turning point is when you talk to people in the business community now, they see the connection between good public schools, adequately funded public schools, and economic development. And there's a lot of leaders, economic leaders in the state that are really adamant about that connection.
Final word, Andrew, you got about 30. What would you say to parents out there worried as heck about what their kids are getting in the classroom?
Talk to your educators. There is not supposed to be a wall that separates public school districts from the public. Go in, meet with principals, talk with teachers, go to your governing board meetings and listen. They'll be a little mysterious at first, but then they'll begin to make sense as you hear the issues discussed. It's a public enterprise, owned and accountable to the public. Let's make it and let's keep it that way.
Thanks to Pearl, Chuck, Andrew, thank you very much. Good to see you all, and best of luck down there at the legislature.
Thank you.
Thanks for being with us. We'll see you next week on Newsmaker Sunday.